One person who perhaps best represents the chaos that has come to define the Republican House, New York Congressman George Santos is gearing up for a possible expulsion, as the House is now set to debate the resolution tomorrow with a potential vote on Friday. Santos has not been convicted of a crime, but he currently faces 23 federal charges that includes fraud, money laundering, and aggravated identity theft. And it appears that the tide may have turned against Santos after House Ethics Committee published its scathing report on how Santos used campaign money to fund his lavish lifestyle. The scandal-plagued congressman told reporters himself this week that he expects to be ousted. And while Republican Speaker Mike Johnson has not whipped votes for the expulsion, he told reporters today that he directed his caucus to vote their conscience. Joining us now from Capitol Hill, NBC News correspondent Ali Vitali, plus writer-at-large for The Bulwark and an MSNBC political analyst, Tim Miller. Mara is also back. Ali, does it seem like there are enough votes to expel George Santos?
Yeah, third time might be the charm here. And certainly when I was on that very wild, careening, 3-hour-long social media conversation that Santos convened the day after Thanksgiving, he also seems to be under the impression that he is about to be expelled from Congress. He was defiant in that. He said that he went from being, and these are his words, the it girl when he was elected to Congress to now being the Mary Magdalene of the body. He had a lot of words for his fellow lawmakers here, a lot of allegations about the kind of lifestyles that they lead here in Washington. But it all comes down to the fact that Santos is very much still the center of this in terms of representing for Democrats exactly what you were just saying, Alicia, which is the idea that Republicans are misrepresenting themselves and shaming this institution of Congress. But then also for his party, he represents a lot of scandals that they would rather just push past. I mean, think about in January when they were trying to convene this Congress, multiple rounds of voting for then Speaker Kevin McCarthy. And in the midst of this, every day seemed to bring some new revelation about a lie or scandal around George Santos. That has not ended, and in fact has only gotten more legally worrisome for him. And now it could culminate in the end of this week with him no longer being a member of Congress. There are political ramifications about that we have long talked about on this show. The idea that the Republican majority is so slim here that even losing just one Republican makes an already difficult job for Republican leadership even more difficult. All of that is true. There's also the likelihood that this district ultimately turns blue. It was a Biden district before that. Now, of course, given the Santos sentiment on the ground, it could easily turn blue now after, whenever the special election is held. All of those things are going to be the ramifications of expelling him. But certainly we expect that that's a very real likelihood. You need 2/3 majority there here to do it. And I think for the people who don't vote to expel, you can look at it less of a vote defending Santos and more of a vote just worried about setting the precedent that they can expel lawmakers from this body, which is already difficult to do, but that they could do that without the courts having reached their own conclusion, which for Santos, the judicial piece of this, the legal piece of this, is still very much a live ball.
Right, which is what we heard last time from someone like Jamie Raskin, who said, I'm a constitutionalist. I mean, Tim, what does it tell you that the current Speaker of the House isn't whipping votes for this, but is also telling his members, do what you got to do?
Well, not exactly a profile in courage, and it's reminiscent of a couple other vote your consciences we've heard from Republicans over the past 8 years. I remember Ted Cruz saying that at the 2016 convention, and then his conscience ended up leading him to vote for the person that had been insulting his wife and father. McCarthy took the same approach on the vote to overturn the election, and then ended up voting with the side that voted to overturn the election based on false premises. So I think Johnson is essentially, following that path. The situation with Santos, he'd been kept around by McCarthy because of what Ali was talking about, that McCarthy needed every vote that he can get. And I don't think that situation has changed for Johnson. So I think if Johnson had his druthers, he'd keep him around, but he has other political interests. For everybody else besides Johnson, George Santos doesn't bring anything to the table. Like a lot of these guys have had to swallow their pride, swallow their true feelings, in order to go along with Donald Trump and put that Donald Trump badge on, as Elise Stefanik was pushing them all to do in the meeting this morning. But because Donald Trump brings them something, like political power, voters, support. George Santos doesn't bring these people anything except for embarrassment. And so, there's not a whole lot of reason for them to come to his defense besides concerns about precedent. And, I think that's why Santos this week is probably going to have to sashay away, to borrow a phrase.
Well, when you say that he doesn't give us anything, he gave us that 3-hour Twitter Spaces, so don't forget that, Tim. This is all a study in contrast, or that is at least what is being set up here. And so it strikes me that you had the president today in Pueblo, Colorado, trying to draw a real distinction between himself and Republicans, his administration and Republicans going after Lauren Boebert in particular. The fact that you have these Republicans who chose not to vote for federal infrastructure, and yet their districts desperately need it. And what strikes me is I understand that this is going to be a presidential election year. There will be a nationalized environment. And yet it would seem that the contrast lands better when you go to a district and say, here is what we want to offer you, and here is what your congressperson prioritized instead.
I think that is, in normal times, how government works. Unfortunately, I think that the Republican Party at this point has proven to be much less interested in governing and in delivering for constituents than in kind of fealty, as we talked about a couple of minutes ago, to not just Donald Trump, but Trump voters. There's a lot of fear among Republicans. They don't want to be primaried from the right. They don't want to be primaried by Trump's voters. A mere tweet can send them out of office. And so I think that's why we see a lot of very strange behavior. I mean, even just, it wasn't that long ago that I remember plenty of Republican members of Congress who, if you called their office as a constituent, you were going to get the exact same services no matter what your political background was. You could call a Democratic member of Congress, same deal. There was a lot of work going on to deliver for constituents. It seems to be a lot less about that, a lot more about elections, the clown show. And I have to say also the George Santos situation is interesting because, ultimately that seat that has flipped to the Republicans is, while leaning red, is up for grabs. And I think the Republicans are essentially saying, we want this to be a sure thing. They don't want those headlines in the ground in New York. It is necessarily, it could flip back to the Democrats, especially with the New York map changing. So I honestly think that this is nothing to do with governing. And unfortunately, so much of Republican politics has nothing to do at this point with policy. And so it's depressing to say that. I think there's a whole conversation about policy going on the Democratic side. And, Joe Biden has been taking a lot of heat from his base of late on that front. But yet the Republican side, it's as though we're on a different planet.
Planet 1 and Planet 2, as Nicole would say.